Our next guest, Dr. Clay Posey, is a member of the UCF College of Business and the Center for Cybersecurity. Dr. Posey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Diane.
Now, you're part of the College of Business. What's the focus of the Center for Cybersecurity?
So the Center for Cybersecurity is a university-level organization of researchers, teachers, educators who are really looking at the forefront of cybersecurity research as well as education. I'm a new member, I'm a member of the newly formed Cybersecurity and Privacy Cluster Initiative here at UCF, and so being in the College of Business, I'm also working alongside faculty members from psychology, political science, and computer science on cybersecurity related issues.
Interesting mix of things. Now, we seem to be hearing about cybercrimes and hacking more and more frequently. Are they occurring more frequently, or are we just hearing more? Are they published more?
Well, that's a very good question. And one of the things I talk to my students about is, how much truth are in the estimates that we see. Yeah. Now, I believe that organizations are incurring more cyber attacks. How much more? It's going to be difficult to tell. Because one of the reasons we might be seeing more is our technology to actually figure out that attacks are happening and ferret those attacks out could be improving as well, so the numbers could be going up in that way. We are seeing some shifts in types of cyber attacks where it could be, rather than all-in-one big bang approach, if you will, to more of a lower and slower, get in with social engineering, hack the insiders first, and then find your way into the treasure troves within the organization.
How, so many of the businesses now, I don't know how they would not operate with some online capacity. What makes them vulnerable for cyber attacks? Well,
so criminal activity in the digital domain is still going to be very similar to criminal activity in the physical and the digital have both analogs to one another. So crime is crime whether you commit it with technology or not. The issue when you have organizations who have a significant online presence is now, rather than worrying about individuals walking into your physical organizations, the brick and mortars, you open it up to the entire world. So as soon as you create that connection, you have to worry about cyber criminals or criminals in general, not only in your regional area, but the worldwide.
So what you're saying, I think, is that certain types of businesses are more vulnerable to cyber attacks than others. Is that so?
That would be correct.
Depending on the kind of information they're housing.
Oh, absolutely. So the issue that we have now, one of the main issues that we have is with health and medical records. One of the reasons being is that when that information is stolen by attackers, whether it's a motivated individual or organized crime syndicate, if you will, they take that information and sell it for profit on the black market. And public and personal health information and patient health information is one of those pieces of information that is most valuable on the black market.
Well, and the sharing of the information is crucial, though, for adequate care. So I don't see a way around that. That's obviously going to be another area of vulnerability.
Oh, absolutely. So anytime you have a system that connects to other systems, that communication opens up a potential vulnerability. And the problem that you have there is once you start connecting one system to another system, your security standards and procedures and protocols automatically influence every other organization you're connected to. So for that reason, you have to be very careful with the vendors whom you select. You can ask Target. That's one of the reasons why they were breached. It was that the attackers went through a third-party HVAC contractor to get into Target systems. So you have to worry about the supply chain of information and systems now.
Now, then how does that work with malicious software? I don't know much about this. I hear ransomware. Is that part of malicious software? And is that a different instance than what you're describing as being hacked through a vendor? I mean, that's another mechanism then, isn't it?
So they're all different types of motivations for hackers. Sometimes it's just self-fulfillment, thrill-seeking out of boredom. And then you have those that have an axe to grind, some type of retaliation, justice to settle. And then you have those who are financially motivated, financially driven. And so ransomware and crypto ransomware is a really bad thing, especially for individuals and organizations that don't have a good policy and procedure for backing up their data to a trusted environment. So in a nutshell, crypto ransomware is malware that infiltrates an organization's network and essentially encrypts sensitive data And unless the organization is willing to pay a specific amount with either Bitcoin or other financial means, that data stays encrypted. And as long as you don't have the decryption key, you can't access that data.
So it's almost hostage.
You're holding the data hostage, absolutely.
Well, these criminals are obviously very smart, very sophisticated. Do we know where they originate? Is that a silly question? I mean, are they is it the United States?
No. It's not a silly question. We can point to the typical suspects of Ukraine, Russia, China. That's true, but we also have some homegrown hackers going on as well. So to say that the U.S. is innocent in all this is not true, but we do see a significant amount from those countries mentioned.
It's interesting when you talked about motivations, because I always think that money drives the bulk of things, but if it's a question of being challenged, then possibly a lot of smart people are doing this. So, as you said, out of boredom or as a feeling of challenge?
Absolutely. So you have thrill seekers, or script kiddies might be the best term for them, or individuals that don't have enough knowledge within themselves to create the type of attack. But they go online, they find a mechanism that someone else has created, and see if they can use it to see if they can break in. One of the individuals I follow is Bruce Schneier, and in his book Secrets and Lies, he talks about, imagine if you go home one day and you find a Post-it note on your refrigerator from someone who got into your apartment or your condo or your house and said, hey, I just wanted to know that the lock on your front door is not working correctly. You might want to fix that. You don't know where they've been once you know that they have been in there. And so you have to do a forensic trail to see where they've gone. So even for those organizations who succumb to attacks simply for thrill seeking or boredom by the attackers, there's still significant concern where those hackers have been once they've been in.
What about best practices? Are there out there anything you recommend to try to protect the software, the hardware?
So being honest, I'm much less knowledgeable about the hardware level, but the software standpoint and within the organizations, by and large, if you have software that you're not using, go ahead and delete it off your systems. I know that one of the recent breaches that we have here of significant impact on U.S. citizens is the Equifax hack. And that they entered through a simple security flaw in a web application. There was an update, a patch, if you will, for that application that was released in March of that year. And Equifax did not apply that patch and were actually hacked in May. So there were several timelines. So in addition to removing software that you no longer use, the software that you do use, when patches and updates come out, go ahead and apply them as soon as possible.
Is there legislation in place that at least requires corporations to have a minimum amount of security depending on the type of data that they house?
Absolutely. So we have both federal and state level mandates.
Okay, so state as well. Okay.
The state as well, but at the state level, it's much more fragmented. So 48 of our states, including Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, as well as Guam, have essentially state-level legislation requiring organizations that if they've been breached, that there is a timeline with which they have to notify people who have potentially been breached. So the next question is, if there are 48, which are the other two that don't have state-level legislation? And unfortunately, that's South Dakota and Alabama currently.
Okay, all right. Well, at least you didn't say it was Florida. I would think then that it's absolutely critical to have a plan of action in place for a corporation if a breach would occur. Do you think that that's common practice? I mean, is that a proactive approach that a lot of them don't take?
Well, to be honest with you, very little of what we do, and I know this is very pessimistic, but I look at it as a realist assessment, is that most of what we do in security is from a retroactive standpoint. We're playing defense rather than offense. And so the United States government and military are looking at some offensive weapons, cyber offensive weapons, but by and large, most organizations take a reactive standpoint. Now having said that, that doesn't mean that they should just throw their hands up and go, we can't do anything about it. The key is that an understanding that you're never going to be 100% secure. As long as you're in operation, especially with online presence, you're on the web, you're opening yourself up to individuals from across the world, you're always going to have risk, and you're never going to be completely 100% risk averse. And so the key is risk mitigation and risk management. And so there are several frameworks, if you will, that help organizations assess their level of risk and what they're comfortable in that. And one of those is NIST, N-I-S-T, the NIST framework. You have COBIT and many different other acronyms. But there are several key frameworks that organizations can follow in order to mitigate their risk. And some of the requirements of organizations, they have further compliance requirements depending on the type of information they house and data and information they house. So for example, health information, medical institutions, they are bounded by HIPAA. Financial services, Graham-Leach-Bliley. So you have federal level mandates, and then you also have individual state level mandates. But again, the state level mandates are very fragmented right now.
Well, let me ask you then, looking at Florida, are we more vulnerable as a state? And the reason I ask is because we have a larger elderly population using health care more frequently, which is a targeted industry. We've got the theme parks, thousands of people using credit cards, debit cards. Does that make us more vulnerable?
So we just, along with my colleagues at Washington State, University of Alabama, and Texas at Tyler, we just actually did a study looking at the roughly 5,000 publicly announced breaches in the United States and figured out how each individual state fared relative to those individual breaches. Florida is among the top 3 in 2 specific types of breaches. The first type of breach are those led by organizational insiders. So after controlling for many different factors, we found that Florida still ranks very highly with a chance of probability that would succumb to attacks from within the organization. Secondly, we have among the highest, if not the highest, incidents in identity theft.
Yes.
And part of that is playing on lack of education, lack of awareness of our elderly population. And so that is, unfortunately, Florida is a hot spot for identity theft.
Now, you said that you don't think there's ever going to be a time that we're going to be completely safe. With the challenges that you've mentioned along the way, what do you see as the future for cybersecurity from a corporate standpoint?
So this is one of the things that I'm really excited to talk about. My colleagues in computer science, they look more at the technical aspect of security, whereas I look at within an organization, when you implement technology, you have human beings on the other side of that technology. And so you can have a very, from a theoretical standpoint, a very perfect system, protected system you put in an organization. But as soon as you put it within that organization, you have imperfect human beings. Now, having said that, I think organizations now and in the near future have to change their perspective on understanding the technical ones and zeros is important, but you have to put at least as much emphasis on understanding the psychology of the insiders and the teams that they're in, their stresses, their perceptions, because realistically, if I'm an attacker, and if I were, I would never admit it, but if I were an attacker, the most common place for me to attack is not the system, it is the people operating the system through social engineering tactics to gain entry into the secure system.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. Scary, but interesting.
Thank you, Diane.